Hey guys, tonight we travel back, way back, to the dusty courtyards of ancient Macedonia, where two curious boys sneak away from sword drills to argue about Achilles and philosophy under the olive trees. You hear the distant clash of bronze spears, smell the smoke of torches crackling at dusk, and catch the wind carrying the scent of ink, sweat, and ambition. That's where Alexander and Hephaestion first lock eyes. Not as generals or gods in the making, but as kids with too much fire and nowhere to put it yet. Their story isn't your average bromance. It's tangled in empire building, epic battles, and maybe a love deeper than what history dared to say aloud. You probably won't survive this journey through emotional warfare, philosophical pillow talk, and some truly questionable royal weddings. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing who's sneaking in a bedtime story across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the sun-baked stones of Pella, capital of Macedon, where Alexander is not yet the Great. Just the son of a king with a lion's pride and a mother who whispers divine blood into his ear at bedtime. Hephaestion, slightly taller and quieter, walks beside him. Not quite a servant, not quite a noble in his own right. His father is a minor noble, a name nobody remembers, but Hephaestion, he lingers. They're only about 13, maybe 14. No one thought much of the pairing at first. Boys bonded during military training all the time, through bruises, hunger, and stolen bread. But something about them makes commanders take notice. They always spar against each other, never against anyone else. They trade jabs like chess moves, Alexander all fire and instinct, Hephaestion all patience and structure. It's a friendship forged not just from shared interests, but from mutual defiance. Even then, Alexander talks like he's meant for more. While other boys idolize local heroes, he recites Homer, dreaming of being a second Achilles. You glance sideways at Hephaestion and he smiles. He knows his role. If Alexander is Achilles, he will be Patroclus. The quieter one. The one who would die first, maybe. It's a dangerous story to admire, but they admire it anyway. Hephaestion isn't flashy. He isn't the best with a sword or the loudest in the room, but he reads faster than Alexander. He quotes Euripides with quiet joy and never flinches when Alexander loses his temper. That's rare. Alexander respects strength, even emotional strength, and Hephaestion's calmness is a fortress. Together, they sneak into the royal library and argue over scrolls. They share figs on the rooftop and dare each other to climb the palace walls after curfew. Once, when Alexander jumps from a ledge and rolls his ankle, it's Hephaestion who carries him back through dark corridors without ever saying, "I told you so." At night, they whisper plans for the future under the stars. Dreams of conquest, of glory, of cities bearing their names. But under those dreams is another layer they don't talk about. They never say, "I love you." They don't have to. Historians still argue whether the feelings between them were romantic or just intensely loyal. Ancient sources dance around the question like nervous courtiers. What we do know, when Alexander's mother Olympias notices the bond, she's not thrilled. She wanted her son to rule the world, not fall for a boy from a lesser noble house. And Philip, Alexander's father, senses something too. Fathers in ancient courts rarely appreciate strong emotional ties outside their control. So, small interventions begin. Hephaestion is given different tutors. They try to separate the boys, put them in different barracks, assign them different duties. But it never works. Like a pair of matched arrows, they fly in the same direction. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Legend says that Alexander once got in trouble for freeing a bird meant for a sacrifice. He couldn't stand the thought of a creature being trapped. It flew away, and everyone scolded him. But Hephaestion smiled and said, "You always save what's yours." Alexander never forgot that. Years later, when he would free entire cities, or burn them, he often turned to Hephaestion first. "Do we save this one?" he'd ask. And Hephaestion, eyes weary, would sometimes nod. Back in Pella, though, all of that is still ahead. Right now, they're just boys, curled under a tree, reading the Iliad aloud like it's scripture. Alexander, of course, insists on playing Achilles. Hephaestion, ever obliging, becomes Patroclus. And just like that, a friendship is mythologized, though they don't know it yet. The sun sinks lower over the palace. Guards call the boys in. Tomorrow they'll train with real swords. Tomorrow they'll study under Aristotle. But tonight, it's just them and the stars, making impossible plans and pretending they'll live forever. You wake up under the same dusty sky, only now there's a new man in the picture. Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, the philosopher whose brain had more wrinkles than a raisin in the desert. He arrives at Mieza, where the young Macedonian elite are sent to be polished into future rulers. Think of it as the ancient version of elite boarding school, but with more scrolls, fewer snacks, and a whole lot of moral dilemmas. Alexander is front and center, of course, flanked, always, by Hephaestion. They're a strange pair among the noble sons. Alexander is restless, always testing the edge of every thought like it's a blade. Hephaestion listens more than he speaks, but when he does speak, even Aristotle stops to hear it. Their days fall into rhythm. Mornings are sword drills and survival exercises. Afternoons are lectures under fig trees about logic, ethics, and the nature of power. Aristotle teaches with gestures and questions, throwing paradoxes like spears. Can a man be virtuous and cruel? What is love, weakness, or strength? Alexander answers with fire. Hephaestion answers with structure. You can see why Aristotle finds them fascinating, two sides of the same golden coin. Here's your historical fact of the night. Aristotle gave Alexander a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by his own hand. Alexander reportedly slept with it under his pillow on campaign, like a sacred text. Guess who copied it for him when it started falling apart? Yep, Hephaestion. Like always, quietly holding together the myth from behind the curtain. One warm afternoon, they debate Achilles and Patroclus again, because they never quite settle it. Was it love? Brotherhood? Fate? Alexander cheekily says, "If I must be Achilles, I'd only follow you into war if you promise to die first." Hephaestion raises an eyebrow and replies, "That's the only part of the story I'd change." Historians still argue whether this is just a poetic retelling or something closer to the truth. Ancient biographers like Plutarch hint at their closeness without naming it. But the fact remains. While most boys at Mieza went home to politics and arranged marriages, Alexander and Hephaestion became inseparable. And here comes the quirky detail for this chapter. Aristotle once taught the boys about the medicinal uses of crocodile dung. Apparently, it was used as a form of primitive sunscreen. The boys were horrified. Alexander swore he'd never smear poop on his face to survive the sun, to which Hephaestion calmly replied, "You'll say that now, and then beg for it in the deserts of Persia." Spoiler alert, he wasn't wrong. At night, they keep studying, candles flickering low, the scent of ink and beeswax curling in the air. Hephaestion's handwriting is neater. Alexander's margins are filled with scrawled ideas, mini battle plans, and what looks suspiciously like nicknames for Hephaestion written and scratched out. Twice. Their friendship, under Aristotle's eye, evolves. It's no longer just boyish loyalty. It becomes ideological partnership. They begin talking not just about glory, but about ruling, about leading with wisdom. Alexander absorbs philosophy like water, but Hephaestion? He watches what the philosophy does to Alexander. And maybe that's what made them so dangerous together. Alexander dreamed, but Hephaestion understood the price. One night, as a storm rolls across the hills, Aristotle poses a question during dinner. What makes a king truly great? Is it his mind, his power, or the people he chooses to trust? Most boys shrug. Alexander stares into the fire. All three, he says, but trust first. A king dies without it. Hephaestion doesn't speak, but when Alexander looks across the fire, which their eyes meet like a quiet vow. By the time they leave Mieza, their fates are locked. Philip II has noticed. He tries again to separate them. Hephaestion is given other postings. Alexander is dragged to official ceremonies, made to kiss new allies, flatter old men. But the bond doesn't break. Every letter Hephaestion writes gets a reply in Alexander's own hand. Sometimes curt, sometimes frantic. Once Alexander wrote, "Without you, I am only half a soul." Not even Aristotle could teach them how to let go. The boys of Pella are now men of vision. The next time they ride out together, it will be under banners, with swords drawn. And behind them, whether Macedon realizes it or not, rides an empire waiting to be born. But tonight, just before sleep, they sit again under the stars. Alexander mutters war plans to himself. Hephaestion listens, polishing his blade. "Do you think we'll actually do it?" Alexander asks. "All of it?" Hephaestion looks up. steady as ever. We won't stop until you're remembered forever. Alexander smirks. And what about you? Hephaestion shrugs. I'll settle for being the one who got you there. And in the silence that follows, you understand. This isn't just loyalty. It's prophecy. You blink, and suddenly the grass of Mysa is gone. Dust replaces it. Thick, hot, clinging to your skin like ambition. The boys are now soldiers, and the games are over. War drums echo through Macedon. Alexander, barely in his 20s, sharpens his ambition as his father Philip prepares for a campaign against Persia. But back home, things get messy. A royal wedding, a drunken insult. And then, just like that, Philip is assassinated during a festival, stabbed in public before his son's eyes. Alexander steps into power like someone who's been waiting in line behind fate for too long. At his side, of course, stands Hephaestion, taller now, broader, with the calm face of someone who already knows how the world will break and bend around a single man's will. The loyalty? Still ironclad. The dynamic? More formal now. Alexander is king. Hephaestion is commander. But the eyes say what titles can't. We're still those boys under the fig tree. Their first battles are not grand Persian epics. They're skirmishes, tests. They chase rebels, crush uprisings, and secure Alexander's throne like it's a fortress built on whispers. One night, as a revolt sparks in Thebes, Alexander charges first into the fight. Because he always does. Hephaestion follows, not to protect a king, but to shield a friend. Here's your historical fact. In the destruction of Thebes in 335 BCE, Alexander razed the city but spared the house of the poet Pindar. Cultural respect or strategic PR? Historians debate that. What we know, it stunned the Greek world and sent a message. Alexander wasn't just his father's son. He was something other now, something sharper. After Thebes, they ride together into Thrace, into Illyria. Small battles, big consequences. The rhythm becomes familiar. Alexander leads from the front. Hephaestion leads from behind, tightening formations, commanding cavalry, fixing what needs fixing. If Alexander is the flame, Hephaestion is the invisible wind that makes it roar. You picture the two of them camping under enemy stars. Alexander, all restless energy, throwing daggers at a tree. Hephaestion, oiling armor and muttering, "That tree never insulted your honor." Alexander grins. Not yet. They fight. Of course they fight. Two strong minds in one tent? It's like keeping two lions in a library. But their arguments never last. One time, Alexander storms off after accusing Hephaestion of not understanding the weight of command. He doesn't speak to him for 2 days. On the third, Hephaestion takes an arrow to the thigh during a river skirmish. Alexander leaps off his horse mid-charge to carry him back. Later that night, in the healer's tent, he sits beside Hephaestion and grumbles, "Next time, you get to be king." Hephaestion winces and whispers, "Hard pass." Historians still argue about the nature of their arguments, whether they were political, personal, or deeply emotional. Some sources say they fought like spouses. Others say they fought like brothers. What's certain? They always found their way back. Here's your quirky tidbit. Alexander once held a mass foot race for his soldiers and insisted Hephaestion compete. Hephaestion hated running, loathed it, finished near the back. When Alexander teased him later, Hephaestion simply replied, "I run faster when you're in danger." And so it goes. Their first real war ends not with a victory parade, but with a map. Persia. The great dream. The Achilles fantasy made flesh. Alexander declares it. We cross the Hellespont. We conquer Darius. We take Asia. Some generals scoff. Others kneel. Hephaestion? He simply starts packing. And now, for the first time, the world will know their names together. Not as boys, not as students, but as conquerors. But before we cross that ocean with them, just pause. Imagine the campfire one last time. Imagine the scent of smoke and steel. Alexander tosses a stone into the flames. "If we die out there," he murmurs, "at least history will remember me." Hephaestion looks sideways. "It'll remember both of us." And you believe him. Because this isn't just about kings or glory anymore. This is about the weight of a shared dream, one held in silence, battle after battle, bruise after bruise. Next stop, Asia. The horse's hooves clop on ancient wood as Alexander and Hephaestion cross the Hellespont, that narrow strait between Europe and Asia. The wind smells different here. Saltier, wilder, as if the air knows they're not just crossing water, but crossing into legend. Alexander pauses at the shore, dismounts, and tosses a spear into the dirt ahead. "Asia is ours," he says simply. A ritual gesture, sure, but also the exact kind of theatrical moment he lives for. Hephaestion stands at his side, eyes narrowed against the sun, not smiling, not frowning, just calculating. Like always, the Persian Empire ahead of them is vast, millions of people, gold enough to drown a king, elephants trained for war. And yet Alexander's army, barely 40,000 soldiers, most of them from a backwater kingdom that the rest of the world still underestimates. Here's your historical fact. This crossing in 334 BCE marked the beginning of one of history's most daring campaigns. Alexander would go on to travel over 20,000 miles without losing a single major battle. And Hephaestion? He was there for almost every step. But let's be honest, Alexander's not always the easiest road trip companion. He rushes into skirmishes, he pushes forced marches, he makes speeches at dawn when everyone just wants breakfast. And Hephaestion? He follows. Not blindly, not meekly, but with a loyalty sharp as any blade. When Alexander gets reckless, Hephaestion reins him in. When Alexander doubts, Hephaestion grounds him. When Alexander sulks, Hephaestion hands him wine and says, "Try conquering fewer provinces today, maybe?" One moment early in the campaign says it all. A city refuses to surrender. Alexander wants to storm it. The generals argue, but Hephaestion stays silent. After the meeting, Alexander corners him. "You disagree?" Hephaestion folds his arms. "I just think you want the glory more than the city." Silence. Then, laughter. Alexander throws an arm around his shoulder. "Exactly. You can feel it. Hephaestion isn't just a friend. He's a mirror, a rare one that doesn't crack under Alexander's heat." Historians still argue whether Hephaestion wielded real power or was just a glorified bestie. But dig deep into the campaign records and you'll find something curious. Hephaestion was given command over the companion cavalry, the elite unit closest to Alexander. He negotiated city surrenders. He led troops independently. You don't get that from just holding the king's shield. Quirky tidbit time. Alexander had a superstition about wearing the same cloak into every major battle. Once, after a river crossing, he dropped it in the mud and refused to fight until Hephaestion personally retrieved it, cleaned it, and handed it back. "So it remembers who I am," Alexander muttered. Hephaestion rolled his eyes but did it anyway. Their tent on campaign is rarely empty. Maps litter the floor, oil lamps flicker, there are debates, arguments, the occasional thrown goblet. But no one, not even the most seasoned generals, dares walk in uninvited. Whatever happens in that tent, it shapes history. One night, after weeks of hard marching, Alexander collapses onto his cot, armor still clinging to him. "Do you think they'll still sing about me in 100 years?" he asks, voice muffled. Hephaestion, sprawled across a blanket, replies without looking up, "Only if they remember who kept you alive long enough to matter." And that's the thing. It's not just that they love each other, however you want to define that word. It's that they need each other. Like lungs need air, like fire needs wood. There's a moment as they ride into Phrygia, the landscape turning more foreign, more golden. Alexander is brooding again. He tends to get reflective between bloodshed. "Sometimes," he murmurs, "I don't think I want to rule the world. I just want to prove I could." Hephaestion glances over. "Then let's do it. And then you can give it away." Simple. No speeches, just trust. You ride with them into deeper Asia, where cities rise like mirages and the war drums grow louder. The path ahead? It winds through myth and blood and silk-draped palaces. But for now, it's just the sound of two horses, side by side, in a world about to change. The morning breaks hot and white as bone as Alexander and Hephaestion reach the fabled city of Gordium. The market buzzes, horses snort, and somewhere nearby, someone is frying onions in oil. The scent makes your stomach twist, but Alexander isn't here for food. He's here for a knot. Yes, that knot. In the city's temple stands a massive yoke of wood, tied with an impossibly tangled length of rope. Legend says whoever unties it will rule all of Asia. Naturally, Alexander walks straight up to it, like it's a math problem he's already solved in his head. Hephaestion watches from the crowd, arms crossed. You can practically hear him mutter, "Here we go again." Alexander pokes, pulls, twists, nothing. The knot is older than empires, dried hard by sun and age. Onlookers begin to whisper. Someone snickers. And that's when Alexander shrugs, draws his sword, and slices the thing clean in two. Boom, prophecy fulfilled. Kinda. Historical fact time. This event, the cutting of the Gordian Knot, is still cited today as a metaphor for bold, unconventional solutions. Did it happen exactly like that? Well, Historians still argue whether he really cut it or cleverly found an untying trick and just said he cut it. Either way, the message was clear. Alexander doesn't wait for fate to be kind. He kicks fate's door open, sword first. Hephaestion's face through all of this? Equal parts unimpressed and proud, like a friend watching someone win at Monopoly by flipping the board. That night, over campfire smoke and the chirp of desert crickets, Hephaestion finally says it. "You're not going to slow down, are you?" Alexander, drinking watered wine, chuckles. "Why would I? The world hasn't seen enough of me yet." "But have you seen enough of it?" Silence stretches. Alexander pokes the fire. "I'm not doing this just to see. I'm doing this to be." Hephaestion knows what he means. Alexander isn't here to tour the world. He's here to leave fingerprints on every stone of it. They ride on, deeper into Asia Minor. Cities surrender at the sound of Alexander's name now. Others resist and pay dearly. You can feel it shift. The air, the army. The boy king from Pella is becoming something else. Sharper, hungrier. In Cilicia, Alexander nearly dies of a fever after bathing in an icy river. His generals panic. Priests declare omens, but Hephaestion, he sits beside him day and night, forcing him to drink, calling his name when he won't wake. Here's your quirky tidbit. At one point, Hephaestion reportedly yelled at a royal physician for touching Alexander too roughly. The doctor, terrified of offending the future god king's soulmate, not his term, but let's be honest, nearly resigned on the spot. When Alexander finally opens his eyes, the first person he sees is Hephaestion. He blinks, rasps, "Did we win yet?" Hephaestion smiles and says, "Not without you." From then on, even the common soldiers speak of them as a single force. The two flames, some call them. One burns bright, the other keeps it alive. But here's the catch. Power is addictive. As Alexander's victories stack up, Granicus, then the taking of Sardis, so does the tension. Some in the camp begin to murmur. They say Hephaestion has too much sway, too much access. Some call him the second king. Others call him worse. But Alexander doesn't care. When he commissions statues of the gods Castor and Pollux, twin brothers bound by eternal love, he orders them in their likenesses. His and Hephaestion's. Subtle? Not even remotely. Historians still argue whether this was a public statement of affection or just clever branding. Either way, it worked. The statues stood in Ephesus, proud and polished, while rumors swirled like desert wind. One night, as they camp near the Tarsus River, Alexander looks up from his maps and says, "Do you ever think we're just stories waiting to be told?" Hephaestion doesn't answer right away. He stirs the fire. "We are," he finally says, "but that doesn't mean we can't write them ourselves." And so they do, with sword and scroll, with blood and silk, with love, quiet, steady, and maybe the truest thing in an empire full of gold. As dawn rises, they ride again. The next destination? Issus. And for the first time, the king of Persia is waiting. The sand smells like tension as you ride into the narrow plain of Issus. The sea glints to one side, the mountains loom on the other, and Alexander, eyes burning brighter than the torches in camp, knows exactly what this is. A trap. You're outnumbered. Darius III, the great king of Persia, has brought a massive army, maybe 2-3 times the size of yours. Elephants, archers, chariots, cavalry. It's a full welcome party with all the glittering pageantry of an empire that's ruled for centuries. But here's the thing about Alexander. He likes bad odds. He studies the terrain, rides the lines, shouts orders like poetry. And behind him, just a horse length away, Hephaestion mirrors every move. No need to explain. He already knows what Alexander's thinking. Historical fact? The Battle of Issus, 333 BCE, was one of Alexander's most important victories, not just for the win, but because it was the first time he directly faced Darius III. And spoiler, Darius fled, left behind his family, royal carriage, and enough silk to wrap the known world 3 times. But before the glory came the chaos. You're in the dust now. Trumpets scream, hooves pound like war drums. Alexander leads the companion cavalry like lightning down the Persian flank. Hephaestion, commanding his own unit, crashes in just behind. Clean, surgical strikes, not flashy. Efficient. Deadly. They don't fight side by side in the thick of it. This isn't theater. But when Alexander's horse takes a spear, rears, and nearly throws him, guess who's the first to notice? Hephaestion cuts down 3 men just to reach him, pulls him onto his own mount, and shouts, "Next time, wait for the rest of us." Alexander's grin is blood-smeared. Where's the fun in that? Here's your quirky tidbit. After the battle, Alexander visited the wounded personally. And when he saw Hephaestion limping from a pulled shoulder, he demanded the royal physician treat him before anyone else, including nobles, including generals, including himself. That raised eyebrows. Whispers began again. He sleeps in the king's tent. He has the king's ear. He has the king's heart. Historians still argue about the extent of Hephaestion's battlefield authority. Was he a strategic mind or just a glorified assistant? But issue settles some of it. Alexander trusted him in the middle of the fire. You don't hand that kind of power to a decoration. And then comes the tent scene. After the battle, Alexander enters Darius's luxurious campaign tent. Inside, Darius's mother, wife, and daughters, left behind in the king's desperate escape. They mistake Hephaestion, taller and more finely dressed, for Alexander and bow to him. The real Alexander walks in and corrects them, but gently. "You were not wrong," he says. "He too is Alexander." Let that sit. Not he's a general, not he speaks for me, just he is me. It's one of the most intimate political slips in all of ancient history. Or maybe it wasn't a slip at all. That night, as they recline on stolen silk cushions, Hephaestion sips pomegranate wine and says, "You could have corrected them with a laugh." Alexander shrugs. "I did." "No. You let it mean something." Alexander doesn't deny it. They sleep in that tent, and if the walls could talk, they'd tell you what historians won't. But for now, all we know is that they ride out the next morning closer than ever. Here's a little scene most people forget. As they bury the Macedonian dead, Alexander insists on reading the names himself. Hephaestion walks with him, candle held steady in the wind, saying nothing. Just standing there while Alexander whispers names into the dark, because that's what Hephaestion does. He stands there, through the storm, through the glory, through the grief. You can feel it now, can't you? This isn't just war. It's a two-man story unfolding on the stage of the world. And next, the king of Persia won't run forever. But then again, neither will time. The air grows heavier as you descend into Babylon, the city of gardens and ghosts. The campaign pushes deeper into Persia, and Alexander, still barely out of his 20s, now commands an empire that stretches like a living map under his boots. The soldiers whisper it. He's more than a king now, maybe even a god. But Hephaestion, he's not whispering anything. He's watching. Babylon opens like a storybook. Massive walls, blue-glazed gates, perfume-scented courtyards, and ziggurats that rise like stairways to the stars. This isn't a city, it's a world. And yet Alexander walks through it not in awe, but with a hunger that seems impossible to feed. Hephaestion is at his side, always. But there's something different now, something slower in his eyes. You get the sense he's studying Alexander not just with admiration, but concern. Here's your historical fact. In Babylon, Alexander began adopting Persian customs, wearing their robes, embracing their court rituals, even expecting his generals to bow to him. For many Macedonians, this felt like betrayal. Foreign, soft, strange. And Hephaestion? He didn't flinch. He bowed. He wore the robes. He translated. Because that's what he did best. He bridged the gaps, not just between languages, but between worlds. But you can imagine the whispers now, louder than ever. Hephaestion's too close. He supports this madness. He wants a throne of his own. Even Alexander's other closest companions, men like Craterus and Ptolemy, begin to bristle. Macedon was built on Brotherhood, not Persian protocol. But when they raise these concerns to the king, guess who they blame? Hephaestion, they say. He enables it. And Alexander's response? He declares Hephaestion Chiliarch, the second in command of the entire empire, like a modern-day prime minister. It's official now. Hephaestion isn't just beside the throne, he's almost on it. Historians still argue whether this was a strategic move or a romantic one. Was Alexander securing his rule or elevating the person he trusted most? Probably both. And yet, even in all this splendor, something feels off. Hephaestion begins spending more time alone. He walks the hanging gardens not in wonder, but in thought. He writes letters, long ones. He trains less. His voice gets quieter. Here's your quirky tidbit. Hephaestion reportedly tried to design an irrigation system in Babylon to cool the barracks with redirected river water. Alexander teased him about being too clever to swing a sword, and Hephaestion replied, "One day you'll thank me for wanting our men to sweat less and live longer." But Babylon has its own rhythm. At night, they drink wine so dark it stains the lips purple. They wear linen so soft it clings like mist. And in the royal palace, they sit by oil lamps and talk about the future. Hephaestion leans against the marble railing, looking over the city's glowing rooftops. "You've done it," he says. "You're the king of kings now." Alexander doesn't smile. "Not yet. You've taken Egypt, Persia. You're worshipped. What's left?" Alexander exhales slowly. "India." Hephaestion's voice stays even. "And after India?" A pause. Alexander doesn't answer, because maybe, just maybe, he doesn't know. The fire inside him doesn't rest. But for the first time, Hephaestion sees it might not ever be satisfied. And that's terrifying, not for himself, but for Alexander. They lie on embroidered cushions later, eyes half-lidded from drink and dust and the day's reports. Alexander whispers, "What if I don't stop?" Hephaestion replies, almost too softly, "Then I'll keep following you." Always, but even always has limits. The sun rises red over the plains near Issus. But this time it's not blood that's coming, it's elephants. Towering beasts armored and trumpet-throated, carrying archers, javelins, and fear. Because now you're in India, and Alexander has marched his army to the edge of the known world. And still, Hephaestion is there. The two of them ride ahead of the column, past stunned villagers and boiling rivers. The heat is unlike anything they've felt. Moist, relentless, wrapping around the skin like wet linen. But Alexander? He's glowing with that same old fire, maybe brighter now, maybe more unstable. And Hephaestion? You notice the lines at the corners of his eyes, the quiet calculation in every word. Historical fact, at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 26 BCE, Alexander faced King Porus and his war elephants. It was one of his most brutal, rain-soaked, close-quarter battles. And it was the last time he would face a major organized army before his men begged to go home. The elephants thunder down the field. Macedonian horses panic. Men scream. Alexander leads the charge. Of course he does, and Hephaestion swings in beside him like a second heartbeat. He commands a separate wing, coordinating flanks through swamp and fog. And while Alexander duels Porus in the center, Hephaestion is the one who keeps the line from breaking. They win, but it's not a clean win. Casualties are high, morale is low. Even Alexander's most devoted men begin to whisper, "This is far enough." And Hephaestion, he hears it too. That night, soaked and sleepless, Alexander slumps beside the fire, silent. The rain taps on his cloak. Across from him, Hephaestion says nothing, just stares into the flames. Until finally, "They're tired," he says quietly. Alexander doesn't look up. "Are you tired?" Hephaestion hesitates. "Yes." You could cut the silence between them with a sword. "But I'd go farther," Hephaestion adds. "I'd go anywhere you asked." Alexander finally meets his eyes. "Even if you hated me for it." Hephaestion's voice is barely audible. "Especially then." Here's your quirky tidbit. Alexander tried to teach his men to eat pickled mango during the Indian campaign. He claimed it cured fevers. Hephaestion claimed it tasted like vinegar-soaked sadness. Still, they ate it, because what else was there? The India campaign changes them. Not just their bodies, though they grow thinner, warier, but their bond. It doesn't weaken, it just shifts. Less laughter, more looks. Less play, more protection. Hephaestion stops challenging Alexander in public. Not out of fear, out of strategy. Historians still argue whether this is when Hephaestion began to fade into the role of silent advisor. Some say he was weary of being seen as the beloved. Others say he understood that Alexander, now nearly divine in the eyes of his followers, needed to be alone at the top. Even from him. Still, every night they share one tent. Still, when the wounds get bad, when Alexander takes an arrow to the chest during the siege of the Malian city, it's Hephaestion who rips through guards to get to him first, who screams for the surgeon, who holds his hand while blood soaks through silk. And when Alexander wakes, pale and coughing, the first words he whispers aren't about gods or glory. He says, "Don't leave me." And Hephaestion answers, "Not yet." But time is creeping in. You feel it in the jungle rot, the slowing marches, the haunted look in their eyes when they speak of home. The empire is vast, but their days together? Not endless. One evening, they climb a hill overlooking the Indus. Fireflies blink through the dusk. Alexander is tracing battle lines in the dirt with a stick. "I want to name this hill," he says. Hephaestion raises an eyebrow. "After you?" "No," Alexander says. "After you." Hephaestion laughs, tired and dry. "You've already given me half the empire." Alexander shakes his head. "And it's still not enough." For the first time in weeks, they smile. The road west is calling. But it's not just distance they'll have to cross. It's time. The road west is quieter now. The elephants are gone, left behind in India. The drums of conquest have dimmed into the occasional beat of a blacksmith's hammer, or the creak of a cartwheel rolling over Persian soil. You ride with Alexander and Hephaestion back across the empire they built, city by city, ruin by ruin, ghost by ghost. But something's changed. The army is heavier, not in numbers, but in spirit. Too many funerals, too many unfamiliar stars. And Alexander, the man who once ran toward the edge of the map, now seems unsure of where to go next. Historical fact: after returning from India, Alexander focused on consolidating his empire. He founded new cities, including some named after Hephaestion, and began integrating Persian nobles into his administration. It was no longer about war, it was about legacy. And what does legacy look like? Well, in Susa, it looks like a wedding. A massive, glittering ceremony where Alexander marries Statera, daughter of Darius III, and insists his commanders do the same, uniting East and West not with swords but with silk and gold. And Hephaestion? He marries Drypetis, Statera's sister. Why? Here's your quirky tidbit. Plutarch says Alexander arranged this marriage so that their children would be cousins. A political move? Probably. But also, maybe, a way to make their bond permanent in royal ink. Historians still argue whether this marriage was real love or staged symbolism. Most agree it wasn't romantic. But that's not the point. The point is that Alexander didn't want a dynasty unless Hephaestion's blood was part of it. At the wedding feast, garlands hang from the pillars, dancers spin like wind. Alexander and Hephaestion sit beside each other, not touching, not speaking, just watching the empire glitter around them. After the ceremony, Alexander finds him alone under a fig tree, wine untouched. "Do you feel different?" Alexander asks. Hephaestion shrugs. "I feel married, to someone I barely know, again." Alexander smiles faintly. "You're still mine." It's not a question, and Hephaestion, ever honest, says, "I always was." But there's something in his voice now, something quieter than loyalty, older than friendship, weariness maybe, or understanding. Because Hephaestion knows what Alexander won't say aloud. This isn't sustainable. The empire is beginning to wobble. Too many enemies wearing smiles. Too many allies feeling replaced. Even the soldiers grow restless, tired of marching, tired of bowing, tired of watching their king disappear into Eastern robes and foreign gods. And then there's Alexander himself. He's drinking more, sleeping less, dreaming stranger dreams. His speeches turn to riddles. His plans stretch farther than maps allow. And only Hephaestion can say the hard things now. "You can't hold this all together forever," Hephaestion warns one night, unrolling reports from Bactria and Egypt, trouble brewing like distant thunder. Alexander leans over the table. "Then I'll die trying." "You will." Alexander's gaze sharpens. "Would you follow me into death?" Hephaestion doesn't blink. "I've followed you into everything else." The next morning, they announce a new campaign. Arabia. Not Persia, not India. A place no one's even sure needs conquering. But Alexander needs something to chase, and if not a crown, then maybe the edge of the sky. Here's your moment of strange truth. Hephaestion is put in charge of infrastructure, canals, roads, grain routes. Less glory, more grit. And yet Alexander promotes him again, makes him successor of the king in case he dies. Not Craterus, not Ptolemy, not even his blood. He chooses Hephaestion, and maybe that was the last thing he could give him. Because the sand ahead, it's the last stretch of the road, and this time Hephaestion won't make it to the end. But for now, he rides beside his king, his best friend, his fire, still holding the line. The city of Ecbatana greets them with sunlit marble and cold mountain air. It's early autumn, the kind where gold leaves drift lazily across courtyards, and the empire feels strangely still, like it's pausing to exhale after years of war and wandering. Alexander and Hephaestion arrive not as conquerors this time, but as rulers returning to a seat of power. There are no trumpets, no elephants, just couriers with reports, generals with questions, and more grain accounts than anyone should have to read in a lifetime. They're both tired, not weak, not broken, but tired in that quiet, aching way that only comes from doing everything you set out to do and still feeling hollow. And that's when it happens. Historical fact. In late 324 BCE, Hephaestion suddenly fell ill in Ecbatana. Fever struck, sudden and fierce, after a short journey. Within a matter of days, perhaps even hours, he was gone. Just like that. No battlefield, no sword, No final defiant stand, just a silent, shattering vanishing. They say it began with stomach cramps, that maybe it was typhoid, maybe tainted food. Historians still argue whether it was disease, bad wine, or even poison. No one knows for sure. But we know this. Alexander was not with him when he died. He'd left briefly, likely for a religious ceremony, and by the time he returned, Hephaestion had already slipped away. And Alexander? He broke. Quirky but true. Alexander had the doctor who treated Hephaestion executed. No trial, no hesitation, just rage and heartbreak. He refused food, refused drink, refused company. For 3 whole days, he locked himself away, silent. Not even his war horses were allowed near. The same man who led armies across continents now lay face down on the cold stone of his chamber, inconsolable. When he emerged, he did so like a storm. He ordered every horse in the empire's stables shorn of its mane. He banned music in Ecbatana. He had all the lamps in the city extinguished. He declared Hephaestion a god. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's a royal decree. Statues were commissioned, shrines built, a hero's cult formed around Hephaestion's name. Alexander sent envoys to the Oracle of Siwa to confirm his deification. Some say he planned an enormous funeral pyre that would rival any in history. White marble, gold panels, over 10,000 animals sacrificed in mourning. It would cost more than some cities were worth. He didn't care, because Alexander had lost battles before, lost friends, lost soldiers, but never this. This wasn't losing a piece of his army. This was losing half his soul. At night, they said he wandered the palace, mumbling to himself. Sometimes he sat for hours at the foot of the empty bedroll where Hephaestion used to sleep. Other times, he stood barefoot on the balcony, staring at the stars as if daring the gods to return him. He couldn't eat in the royal dining hall. He couldn't read the reports Hephaestion used to annotate. He couldn't sleep. One of his scribes later wrote, "He spoke to him as though he had only just stepped out of the room." Hephaestion had followed Alexander into every fire. But this fire? Alexander had to walk through it alone. And yet, even grief can't stop the turning of the world. The empire still needs its king. Letters pile up, plots brew, and far away Arabia waits. So Alexander, the boy who conquered half the earth with Hephaestion at his side, sharpens his blade again. But something's changed. There's a new coldness in his smile, a new edge in his voice. As if the loss didn't make him softer, it made him sharper. Less man, more myth. And in his heart, a silence where laughter used to live. The desert looms again, hot, wide, and indifferent. You ride with Alexander now as he marches toward Arabia, that last mysterious edge of the empire. But the road feels different. The dust tastes different. Everything does. Because Hephaestion isn't there. Not riding beside him with a half smile and a sarcastic remark. Not passing him notes during strategy meetings. Not walking the campfires late at night, checking on injured men, quietly nudging Alexander to rest for once. Now, it's just Alexander. And an echo. Historical fact, after Hephaestion's death, Alexander threw himself even deeper into his campaigns, launching preparations for an ambitious expedition to Arabia. He redesigned harbors, plotted trade routes, and reorganized entire provinces. On paper, he was more productive than ever. But anyone watching closely could see. It wasn't about ruling, it was about distracting. He pushes his generals harder, the marches get longer. The punishments get stricter. At one point, he has a man executed for speaking Hephaestion's name with anything less than reverence. Another is whipped for smiling too broadly at a banquet. Whispers begin. He's not grieving, he's unraveling. Still, Alexander doesn't stop. He drafts plans for canals between the Euphrates and the Red Sea. He orders a massive fleet constructed along the Persian Gulf. He dreams of sailing to the edge of the world, literally. And the strangest part? He still talks to Hephaestion. Not in grand, dramatic monologues, quietly, casually, like you'd speak to a roommate in the next room. "You'd hate this heat," he mutters during a march. "You'd have complained about the boots." Soldiers glance at him, then quickly away. Quirky tidbit. Alexander began holding private banquets, where a place was always set for Hephaestion, with his favorite wine poured. No one was allowed to sit there. If the wine cooled untouched, so be it. He tells no one where Hephaestion is buried. Some say it's Babylon. Others say he ordered the body mummified and kept it nearby. One traveler later claimed to have seen a locked tent with golden guards and incense always burning. The king's silent room. Historians still argue whether Alexander's obsession was genuine grief divine devotion, or a descent into madness? Maybe it was all three. Maybe the world's most ambitious man simply lost the one person who tethered him to being human. You start to notice something in the way he signs letters now, almost always alone at night, writing by oil lamp glow. He always includes one name in the margins. Hephaestion. Not out of duty, but because in his mind Hephaestion is still here, still beside him, still helping make the impossible feel possible. One night, as the army camps near a scorched outpost, Alexander walks alone into the dark. The guards don't follow. No one dares. He sits on a dune, pulling his cloak tighter against the desert wind. Above him, the stars smear across the sky like silver dust, and maybe, just maybe, he speaks softly to the air. I told you I'd build a world for us. The wind shifts, and now what do I do with it? There's no answer, but the empire stretches behind him, vast and restless, and even without Hephaestion, it needs tending. So he stands, brushes the sand from his boots, and walks back to camp. The skies above Babylon shift from gold to gray as Alexander returns, not as a conqueror, not as a newlywed, not even as a dreamer chasing India, but as a man weighed down by shadows. The gates creak open. Priests bow. Foreign dignitaries prepare speeches. But Alexander doesn't notice, because this time the capital feels hollow. No Hephaestion to race him up the palace stairs. No gentle voice reminding him to eat before he speaks. No partner to read between the lines of royal reports or laugh at the way Macedonians still mispronounce Persepolis. He's more powerful than ever, and completely, utterly alone. Historical fact. In early 323 BCE, Alexander entered Babylon and began working feverishly to establish it as the capital of his global empire. He mapped out canals, granaries, garrisons. Diplomats flooded the court. Envoys arrived from India, Ethiopia, and even Carthage. But he himself was thinner, slower, restless. He began spending long hours in the temple of Marduk, the Babylonian high god. Some say he fasted. Others say he offered incense and asked oracles questions they refused to answer aloud. The grief hadn't faded. It had calcified, quiet and sharp beneath his skin. He begins organizing the grand funeral he never finished for Hephaestion. Plans are enormous. A 60-meter-high pyre layered with gold, ivory, carvings of lions and eagles, flanked by statues of gods and heroes, all in Hephaestion's honor. He spares no expense. He bankrupts cities to fund it. This is no mere memorial. It's a cathedral of loss. Quirky tidbit, Alexander hired Egyptian embalmers to preserve Hephaestion's body according to both Greek and Egyptian rites. Double traditions, double honors. He wasn't just honoring a friend, he was enshrining a legend. The court grows nervous. His generals whisper. Some say Alexander is losing touch. Others say he's becoming a god, just like he always claimed Hephaestion would be. And then, as if driven by something invisible, Alexander throws himself back into his plans. He surveys canals, inspects fortifications, meets with builders, scribes, prophets. He does everything but stop. One night, after overseeing yet another construction site until dusk, he returns to the palace. Servants light his bath. He waves them off. He sits in the water, alone. It's too quiet. He looks down at the ripples and murmurs, "You'd have made this city better than I ever could." And then, softly, almost broken, "Why'd you leave first?" He leans back against the cool stone, arms stretched out on either side, eyes closed. And for just a moment, maybe he imagines Hephaestion walking through the doorway, carrying a scroll, eyebrows raised. Maybe he hears the echo of their old debates. Maybe he remembers the way their hands brushed when no one was looking. Historians still argue whether Alexander intended to finish the Arabian campaign, or if he planned to stop in Babylon forever. The truth is probably neither. He didn't know what came next, not without the person who always helped him figure it out. The generals begin to notice something else now. He rarely smiles. He eats barely enough to stand. He stops answering letters. And sometimes, late at night, they see him walking barefoot on the palace roofs, head tilted back to the stars, looking, waiting, searching for a voice that doesn't come. But he still wakes up each day and pushes forward. Because what else is there? He once promised Hephaestion a world, and now that it exists, he can't let it slip away. Not yet. But the cracks are starting to show, and somewhere in the burning heart of the empire, something ancient is whispering. Not even gods live forever. The air over Babylon thickens like syrup as the summer of 323 BCE settles in. The Tigris and Euphrates swell with heat. The palace stones sweat at noon, and Alexander, once tireless, unstoppable, is slowing, not openly, not in front of the army. But in the quiet hours, when the maps blur and the nights stretch too long, the weight begins to show. He's thinner, his temples ache, his skin sometimes glows with fever, and his hands tremble just slightly when he pours his own wine. But no one says anything, because what would you say? He's Alexander the Great. He doesn't get sick. Historical fact, in June 323 BCE, just weeks after a massive royal banquet, Alexander fell seriously ill. He developed a high fever, severe abdominal pain, and could no longer speak clearly. Within days, he was bedridden. It began small, just a headache, a shiver. He brushed it off, laughed about it even. "Babylon's getting soft," he said with a wheeze. "I should have stayed in the desert." But by the second day, he couldn't stand without help. By the fourth, he could barely speak. And still he whispered names into the air. Some were generals, some were places he wanted to conquer, but over and over there was one name, Hephaestion. His men took turns waiting outside his chamber, silent and pale. Inside, the great conqueror clung to his bedsheets, whispering to someone no one could see. Quirky tidbit, Alexander reportedly passed his signet ring to Perdiccas, one of his generals, but some claimed he mumbled something else, possibly a name, as his final instruction. Several sources suggest that name wasn't a general. It might have been Hephaestion. Historians still argue whether Alexander died of typhoid, malaria, poison, or an autoimmune condition. The truth is, we'll never really know. All we know is, at age 32, the man who carved empires into mountains and rewrote the world's maps simply stopped breathing, just like that. Silence. The court didn't believe it at first. Some claimed he was only sleeping. Some priests insisted his body hadn't begun to rot after several days, a sign of divine heritage. But the truth? He was gone. And in the same palace where Hephaestion had died just months earlier, Alexander joined him in absence. Here's where it hurts most. There was no farewell. No quiet goodbye, no final touch of the hand, no whispered word into a trusted ear. Whatever last thoughts passed through Alexander's mind, if they did, they vanished with him. But everyone knew who he was thinking of. One general reportedly found a sealed letter on Alexander's desk. The wax was cracked from the heat. Inside it read, "To be buried not in Ege, but beside him." And just like that, the two flames that had once lit up the world, one bold and brilliant, the other steady and true, were both gone. The empire shattered, the generals began to fight, the world began to forget. But somewhere in the dust of Babylon, two names linger like footprints on wet stone. Alexander, Hephaestion, always together, even when the stars blink out. The days after Alexander's death are thick with confusion and smoke. Inside the palace walls, courtiers weep behind curtains. Outside, soldiers pound their chests in disbelief. And in the throne room, the once mighty generals gather, not to honor the king, but to divide him. Because now, there is no Alexander. And worse, there is no Hephaestion to hold the pieces together. Historical fact. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fractured into what we now call the Diadochi Wars, a series of brutal conflicts between his generals. No one knew who was supposed to rule. There was no named heir strong enough to hold the crown. Only ambition. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Perdiccas, Antigonus, Craterus, they all wanted their share. And with Hephaestion gone, there was no steady voice to say, remember what he stood for. So the war drums began again. The soldiers wanted Alexander's body brought to Ege, the royal burial ground in Macedon. But Ptolemy had other ideas. He hijacked the funeral procession and rerouted it to Egypt, eventually placing Alexander's tomb in Alexandria. But there's a strange gap in this story, an echo, a silence. No one ever quite says what happened to Hephaestion's tomb. There are references to shrines, mentions of burned offerings, even reports of a temple in Ecbatana built in his name, with statues of lions and phoenixes. But no stone marked the final place. No marble slab carved with "Here lies the one he loved most." Quirky tidbit. Some ancient sources claim Alexander had planned a dual mausoleum for himself and Hephaestion, where they would rest eternally side by side. A temple to brotherhood, to loyalty, to a kind of love the world didn't know how to name, but it was never finished. Some scholars believe it was scrapped after Alexander's death. Others think it was built and destroyed in the chaos that followed. Still others whisper that the true resting place of Hephaestion lies somewhere hidden, kept secret by those who understood what he meant to the king. Historians still argue whether Hephaestion was ever truly mourned by the world, or just by Alexander. Because here's the truth. Most of the history books don't talk about him much after that. He fades, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, gone in a paragraph. But not to Alexander. In the letters, in the scrolls, in the broken-hearted decrees carved into stone, you find Hephaestion's name again and again. And not just as a general, not just as a second in command, but as someone irreplaceable. They say the gods envy mortals for one reason, because we die. Because love, when fleeting, becomes something eternal. Maybe that's why Alexander elevated Hephaestion to divine status, not just to immortalize him, but to say, you mattered more than the conquest. He once said that he owed everything to his mother, his teacher Aristotle, and to Hephaestion, but only one of those names followed him into battle, into silence, into starlight. And now the stories belong to us, because for all the monuments, the wars, the maps, this is the real legacy. Two boys from Macedon, dreaming bigger than anyone thought they should, and holding on to each other for as long as time would allow. The years roll forward like slow thunder. Empires rise, crumble, and are rebuilt again under different flags, different gods, different names. And yet, the stories of Alexander and Hephaestion remain, hidden in the cracks of marble columns and the yellowed corners of ancient scrolls. Not as a legend of war, but as a legend of loyalty. Alexander's successors carve up the empire like spoiled sons fighting over a crown too heavy for any one head. Babylon falls to one general, Egypt to another. The cities once called Alexandria flicker across maps like stars that have already died. But in whispers, the story remains. Historical fact, in the centuries following Alexander's death, both he and Hephaestion became figures of myth. In Egypt, Alexander was worshipped as a pharaoh. In Greece, poets sang of him as a hero touched by gods. And Hephaestion? He became harder to find, shrouded in mystery. His story carried more in rumor than record. Still, travelers in ancient times told tales of a shrine deep in Persia where wildflowers bloomed year-round. Locals claimed it was a place where two lovers of the sun once slept. No names, just memory. Historians still argue whether Hephaestion's legacy was erased deliberately, downplayed by Roman authors who couldn't grasp the depth of his relationship with Alexander, or lost simply because his life ended before the full story could be written. But those who look for him find him in side notes, in footnotes, in grief-stricken letters etched in fading stone, and always, always in Alexander's shadow. Or maybe not in his shadow, maybe at his side. Quirky truth. In the Renaissance, artists and writers began to rediscover the story of Hephaestion. Some saw him as the perfect general, others as Alexander's lost heart. Even in modern times, historians revisit the letters, the dedications, the silk-draped funerals, the temples, trying to read between the lines of ancient Greek silence. Because they feel it too. This wasn't just friendship. It was something else. You stand now, centuries later, on the banks of the Euphrates. The river glints under starlight, just as it did when Alexander wept here. The reeds sway in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, stones rest beneath the earth. Forgotten, maybe, or simply waiting. You imagine a voice beside you, calm and dry. You're getting sentimental. You smile. It's aloud. And if you close your eyes, really listen, you might just hear two sets of footsteps walking side by side across time. One bold, one steady, one forever chasing the horizon. The other always making sure he didn't go too far. Wind down. 300 words. So here we are, friend. You've walked the dusty roads of Macedon, crossed the deserts of Persia, followed the elephants into India, and wandered through the marbled quiet of Babylon. You've seen battles and banquets, temples and tombs, and through it all, two souls walking side by side. Alexander the Great may have conquered half the known world, but when the stars flickered out and the drums went quiet, it wasn't gold or glory he called for. It was Hephaestion. Because even the strongest need someone who sees them, not just their victories, but their flaws, their grief, their silence. And for Alexander, that someone was always there, until he wasn't. Maybe that's the part history forgets too easily. That love, true, steady love, can shape an empire as much as war. And in the end, what lingers isn't just the names carved in stone, but the bond too deep for time to erase. So now, as your eyelids grow heavier and your breathing slows, let that image carry you. Two figures standing quietly on a palace balcony, shoulder to shoulder, watching the stars burn above Babylon. No armies, no trumpets, just peace. Sleep well, traveler. And remember, sometimes the greatest stories aren't about how far someone went, but who walked beside them to the very end.